From the College Football Hall of Fame, this is DawgNation and SEC Media Days, brought to you by Merriweather and Tharp.
Hello, everybody. I'm Brandon Adams. Happy to have Connor Riley, Kaylee Mansell as we recap the proceedings at SEC Media Days here thus far. We're recording this on Tuesday afternoon. Of course, we're brought to you, as you just heard there, by Merriweather and Tharp, your source for Georgia divorce. The Georgia Bulldogs have had their time here in Atlanta. Connor, you followed around Kirby Smart, the Georgia players. I would say for the most part it was kind of an uneventful experience for Georgia, which is probably exactly the way they wanted it. I did think he was a little early. I thought it was interesting, I should say, earlier this morning to get a little bit of not quite a dust up, but certainly Kirby had a little jab ready for the media related to whether Will Muschamp is or isn't part of this Georgia coaching staff this year in an analyst role. To me, these sort of very small-scale issues that we make kind of a very big deal about, this is about as Georgia as it gets, both Kirby being critical of this and obviously fans showing a lot of interest in it. That's about as close to fireworks, I guess, as we got from Kirby today.
Yeah, Kirby, in the small session that he did with local reporters prior to, first sort of tipped off that he was, I was going to tab Nick Saban to replace Will Muschamp. But, I think this is Kirby an example of him maybe not seeing that this is as big a deal to the fan base or to the outside world as it is to perhaps him. They've known for a while that Muschamp, I think even from last year, was going to have a more diminished role. But at the same point in time, I think anytime Kirby needs to get Muschamp on the phone, he can do so and have him help out and have him do things around the program. So in that sense, I understand where Kirby is coming from. And look, like the media becomes an easy target with this. There was a lot of interest when it was shown that Will Muschamp was not in the Georgia media guide. And then you have the fact that yesterday, the biggest news that seemed to come out yesterday was Greg McElroy saying that some people think that Nick Saban might come back to coaching. Kirby Smart very much goes against that, and I think it allows him to sort of tie everything together here at SEC Media Days.
All right, so let's talk about both those kind of, I guess, addendums to all of this. Kaylee, here's one of the things I find fascinating about Will Muschamp. Over the course of years, and listen, I would say that I've always been a Muschamp fan. I think he's a good coach. I think he's certainly a great resource for Georgia. I don't know there's been any figure who's grown in popularity over the course of, let's say, the last 10 years, more so than Muschamp, where I think Georgia fans now universally believe that he's like a football guru and that you get great value in having him around. But when he was last South Carolina coach in 2020, I guess it was, I don't know that all Georgia fans necessarily thought that at the time, but over the course of this 5-year period between now and then, Muschamp is like as favorable. His favorability ratings are about as high as anybody. It's a really interesting ascent from him in terms of fan popularity, which is kind of the sort of, I guess, the engine that drives this entire conversation.
I'm confused. We've had Will Muschamp right here across from us all week, or at least somebody who literally looks exactly like him, that every time I see him I have to turn around and double check. I mean, you talk about Will Muschamp going from South Carolina to the position that he's in now, and the one thing or one person we can compare him to that's been in a similar position is Mike Bobo, also at South Carolina. Not as favorable with the Georgia audience, but I think it's the relationship that Will Muschamp has been able to develop with his players over time. And I think you could even see the popularity last year when we were at the Sugar Bowl and it went viral that he was even on the sidelines. I think it gives the Georgia fan base a sense of comfort in knowing that Will Muschamp still has something to do with the program, even if he's not in a big of a role as he once was. So we don't know what that role looks like, but I do think that Georgia fans just feel a lot better about what's going on the defense if they know that Will Muschamp has something to do with it.
Okay, coming up in a moment, we're going to recap all of the best moments from Georgia's appearance at SEC Media Days today. We'll give you a nice presentation of that here coming up in just a couple of minutes. Let me, though, before we get there, talk about the other thing that you made mention of, which was kind of a part of Kirby's sort of funny jab about all this. You can read more about that at DawgNation.com. Connor had a nice story about that earlier this morning. I am 100% totally in favor of rumors about Nick Saban coaching again on a number of fronts. Y'all, I'm much older than both of you are. I am old enough to remember when SEC Media Days was a circus. You had the Tennessee coach afraid to show up because he was going to get subpoenaed. You had, even as recently as a few years ago, Texas A&M allegedly, basically spoiling the announcement that Texas and Oklahoma are coming to the SEC. Like, even in this decade of this century, we've had some nice little fireworks here. We don't get as much of that, it seems like, anymore. So, Greg McElroy with Paul Feinbaum on his radio show saying, I've had people tell me that maybe Nick Saban coaches again, which, by the way, that could have only come from one source, I believe. But I'll leave you to sort of speculate who that might have been. I like all of this. What's your reaction to what has been the most fun story of this week, even if it's likely untrue?
Yeah, and Kirby sort of hit that on the nail on the head this week. There's just not a lot of buzz at media days today, and some of that, with Georgia in particular, I think is by design. Where Daylen Everrette is your most engaged and interesting speaker. I think that's certainly
was great today, by the way.
Yeah, he was. I don't want to take anything away from him, but Georgia, very businesslike in a way that maybe doesn't draw attention to the upcoming season and get people talking in a positive manner. But Kirby called out the aspect of the media, I think, making this into a story of could Nick Saban come back and coach? Is that at Alabama? Is that at another school? There's a buzz that comes with that I think in hearing Kirby talk about it, he is more than fine to not have to deal with that. And being here the last 2 days, it just seems like there's a lot less buzz in general around a media day. And the fact that that's the one big story that has really popped so far, I think only further illustrates Smart's point.
What did you think about it, Kaylee?
Well, you got to think about the timing of it all, because there's a good chance that Greg McElroy has been sitting on this information for days, if not weeks, and he knew that this would be the perfect time on day one of SEC Media Days to release this information, because, it got to every single person in the room pretty fast. And if you look at it from a coach's perspective, especially for someone like Kirby Smart, this is absolute gold for him, because not only with Nick Saban being his friend is it kind of funny, but it's also like, okay, well, the heat's off me, and I'm sure that every other coach that's going to be here this week feels that exact same way, that the biggest storyline isn't even involving any of the teams that are here and the things they have to speak on. It's about somebody who's not even coaching in the conference anymore. So I'm sure that they were all glad that information got out there, whether it's true or not.
So 2 things on this for me quickly. The reason why I like this, in addition to what I said a moment ago, is as someone who hopes to never retire, God willing, I hope to still be working at like 90 if I could live that long. I think that if you can coach, you probably should. I think if you can be a broadcaster, you probably should. If this thing you have a chance to do, if you can still do it, Connor, I don't think you should stop.
It's interesting that Nick Saban not here this week as one of the many broadcasters that the ESPN has brought in. And to your point, Bear Bryant passed away very quickly after he stopped coaching. Joe Paterno, the same thing. These guys who we consider the icons of the sport in terms of what they did on the field. Sometimes when you're not coaching, you just wonder about what else is out there. And there are some people that just, as you point out, some people just want to work. And Nick Saban, I think there is a part of him that very much misses some aspects of coaching in dealing with all that. And if we ever get to a point where roster management is a little bit more normalized, or at least what it used to look like, though that I doubt is ever happening, but if we get to a point where roster management is stabilized, maybe then Nick Saban considers coming back. But, as the Tyler Atkinson news showed today, I don't know how close we are to any of that.
And we'll talk about the Tyler Atkinson situation from Georgia coming up here in a couple of minutes. Kaylee, the other part about the Nick Saban thing that I really like is, look, one of the most important parts of battle is propaganda. Propagandas help win skirmishes. And in the SEC, Georgia's got a lot of programs it's battling against. And the idea that Nick Saban could coach again, I think is a real big problem for someone like, say, Kalen DeBoer in Alabama going into year 2, because the comparison's always going to exist of, what do you look like compared to your old, the person that had the job before you got here. And so anything that makes Alabama's job a little more difficult, Kalen DeBoer's job a little bit more difficult, or any of the other SEC programs that might say, hey, maybe Nick Saban would be better than the current guy we have. Considering the fact that Georgia really isn't mixed up in all of that, anything that sort of serves as useful propaganda against these other programs, I'm 100% in favor of all of that.
Yeah, there is not one coach who's worse off from this situation than Kalen DeBoer, because when things started to fall apart last year, after the loss to Vanderbilt, after the loss to Oklahoma, they immediately go into comparing him to what Nick Saban did. And now that Nick Saban's offered up as even an option again, that outcry for any time something goes wrong within the Alabama program is going to be higher than ever, because now all of a sudden, Nick Saban might be available. The way we've looked at it this last year or two is when your program starts going wrong, everybody wanted to go get Lane Kiffin. That was the solution to all their problems. Well, suddenly now that becomes Nick Saban, now that everyone thinks that this is even a possibility to begin with.
I think that's exactly right. So, Connor, you heard him mention Tyler Atkinson. a little earlier. We're going to talk in a moment about the one that got away from Georgia here after a great series of recruiting wins. The Dogs did not win today with 5-star linebacker Tyler Atkinson. What exactly is the story behind all of this? We'll get to more of that here coming up in a minute. Also coming up, a tremendous recap of the best moments from Georgia's appearance at SEC Media Days today. We've got plenty to say about that. And, of course, all of our SEC Media Days coverage is brought to you by our friends at Merriweather and Tharp. Now, listen, this is a fun thing, being here talking college football with good friends. We love all of that. Unfortunately, though, some conversations in life nowhere near as enjoyable. And perhaps for you right now, you may think you're in the midst of potentially having to have one of those. The divorce process can be scary and confusing. You've probably done everything you can to avoid it, and frankly, I think you probably should. But in some situations, that divorce process is an unavoidable next step for you in your life. Perhaps it wasn't chosen by you. It's just simply something you're going to have to now confront. And you have really no say in the matter. Sometimes that's the way things go down. Well, if you've got questions about the divorce process, our friends at Merriweather and Tharp can provide those answers for you. Now, all across the state, including the brand new office just opened up in Columbus. So please find them online. It's GeorgiaDivorceTeam.com. GeorgiaDivorceTeam.com. Merriweather and Tharp is your source for Georgia divorce. Once again, online, it's GeorgiaDivorceTeam.com. That's the website, GeorgiaDivorceTeam.com. Merriweather and Tharp is your source for Georgia divorce. Longtime friends of what we do here at DawgNation, and a big part of our SEC Media Days coverage. The Dogs have had their turn here. Kirby Smart was here. Gunner Stockton was here. Daylen Everrette, C.J. Allen representing the UGA defense. Let's go back and relive some of the best moments of today as we recap SEC Media Days right now, courtesy of our friends at Merriweather and Tharp.
Thank you, Greg, for that warm welcome.
Now we have C.J. Allen up here. Would anybody like to start with questions?
We're going to be really young, especially on the offensive and defensive lines, but 54% of our players are coming into their first or second year. So what do you get with that? You get youthful exuberance.
We've had a great off season, just getting to know everybody and coming together and really connecting.
Gunner's just a great competitor. He wants to win. He comes in with his head down and work. This is something about him.
The number one thing Gunner does is he leads. He does it the right way each and every day. He commands the room.
I've been hanging out with him over the summer and stuff. I've seen him try to make that effort to step up and speak up more. So he's definitely growing as a leader, and we're definitely proud of him for doing that.
I get more attention, in Athens, getting pictures and stuff like that. But I think that comes with the role, and probably just being more vocal with the team and just enjoying it. I've enjoyed the process so far, and I can't wait for the season. I'm really excited.
We sell relationships over transactions. We think the relationship still wins out because the relationship allows you to push people and demand excellence.
We don't fight, we are a target. We approach every opponent the same way, no matter who we're playing. So no matter if we're lined up versus the 9U Bulldogs, we're going to approach it the same way.
So you want me to pump up Jordan Hare? Is that what you want me to do?
If we're doing anything cutting edge, I'm not sharing it today, I can assure you of that. Yeah, I called him and offered him Muschamp's job, but he was overqualified, so he wasn't interested. No, I heard all the scuttlebutt and everything about it. I almost laughed. It was like somebody needed something interesting to talk about yesterday. So
just this offseason, always working on something and trying to get better at it. And I can always get better at the little things. And for me, it's been a bunch of footwork stuff.
I've always been trying to work on doing a better job, tracking the ball in the air. That's something I feel like, even if you are good at it, that's something you can always work on.
Fire, passion, and energy. Just fire, passion, and energy. Play with fire, passion, and energy.
Fire, passion, and energy.
Passion, energy guy. We talk about that a lot.
It's guys that have fire, passion, and energy.
We play them with their fire, passion, and energy.
I've seen what it looks like to have fire, passion, and energy. A love for the game and fire, passion, and energy.
Coach Smart used to play DB, so he really has different expectations, I would say. But at first, I really didn't know how I would handle it. Just it would kind of overwhelm me when I was freshman, back when I was a freshman and stuff. But I feel over time, really just understanding you got to hear the message he's saying and not the tone, and just really just understanding what he wants from me and just hearing that and not really taking it as personal and just keep trying to improve. So
this is a pretty good life. I'm earning $200K a year. I'm very comfortable. And you don't reach your goals being comfortable. You don't attain great success. None of those people I mentioned before were ever comfortable.
I think any chance you get to go out there and put your helmet on and play football, especially for Georgia, just means a lot. So all those games are important to me.
We found it's not how fast you run the 40 or how talented you are. It's how fast you run the 40th 40 and how passionate you are in the third and fourth quarter when you're tired. And sometimes those guys have more intrinsic value for your team than maybe a guy who is a scholarship player but is disinterested because he's not playing.
Trying to learn the game more, learn the game, like understand instead of just what I have to do, what everyone else has to do, just because I feel like that will just help the position more, or even help the defense more, because you really have a better understanding of who's doing what and like where your help is and stuff. I would definitely say like that part of the game.
Thank you, and go Dogs.
Have there, our Cody Chafin's putting good work together there on that of some of the top moments from Georgia here for SEC Media Days. We're recapping all of this right now, courtesy of our friends at Meriwether and Tharp. We've got Kaylee Mansell, Connor Riley, along with me, Brandon Adams. We're happy to have you with us. Kaylee, obviously Gunner Stockton was pretty heavy in the spotlight today. Assumed Georgia starting quarterback, although Kirby Smart would not confirm that. But getting a pretty big spotlight here at Media Days. You had a chance to watch a lot from Gunner today, really a long period of time, seeing what Gunner had to say. How did you think Gunner did? What stood out to you about him today?
Well, the thing I immediately noticed is that he definitely is a student of the Kirby Smart school of tell you absolutely nothing. But the one thing that he will light up when he talks about, when he gets questions about himself, it's just good, great, very little. But it's when he talks about other players, I think that's when his personality really starts to shine. I felt like one person that he highlighted today in his time at the podium was his relationship with Lawson Lucky, and how from day one Lawson Lucky was a person that put his head down and worked really hard, and they've been able to continue to grow their bond in this offseason a lot. So he said he spent much time with his receivers and pass catchers as he can, but that was really all we got out of him today. But I thought his points on Lawson Lucky said a lot for what's to come between them two this season.
And Connor, when it comes to Gunner, sometimes it's the vibe, if you want to call it that, that's maybe more important than the actual words that are spoken, because I think the message of sending Gunner here to Media Days is not just the de facto announcing of him as the starting quarterback, which, let's not mistake it, that's what this is. But I think it's also a reminder that his teammates like him, whether it's a close relationship with Lawson Lucky. I know that he and Oscar Delp are obviously close, but you get the impression, I had a chance to talk to Daylen Everrette about this today, you get the impression that a lot of guys in this locker room like Gunner Stockton. And I don't think it's unfair to Gunner to have him ranked near the bottom third, whatever you want to do, in terms of the SEC quarterbacks to begin the year. That is to be expected for an inexperienced quarterback. That's not unfair to me. But the opinion of the guys who play with him and who work with him throughout the summer, it's their opinion that matters most to me. And they seem to want to give him a ringing endorsement, and I do think you have to take something from that.
It, in my mind, is very much a 180 from where we were at SEC Media Days a season ago, where Carson Beck came in as the guy that everyone was talking about as the quarterback in the SEC. He was the number one guy in the league. And I think knowing what we know now, Carson just did not resonate with his teammates in the same way that Gunner so clearly does. You hear guys talk about Gunner. They speak about him and his leadership and ability in a way, quite frankly, they never did with Carson Beck. You hear Kirby Smart talking about him today. Gunner leads from the front. We never really heard Kirby say that about Carson a year ago, and it's not like, to Kaylee's point, Gunner is this verbose, rah-rah, big talker. That is not who he is. I think that Gunner has found a way to thread the very difficult needle of maybe being on the quieter side, but still being an effective leader. That's a big reason why he's here today. I think that was maybe perhaps my biggest takeaway of, independent of him being the starting quarterback, which he is going to be, despite Kirby Smart not wanting to publicly come out and name him as such. Gunner is also one of the best leaders on this team, and I'm very interested in seeing how that plays out over the course of this season.
Kaylee, you and I were talking before the show began. You made mention of the fact that when Kirby had a chance to speak in the big podium, kind of what we call the big room that's behind us here, kind of tried to spin the notion that Georgia's an inexperienced team. I think the number he used was 54% of the roster, players in their first or second year. Well, if you think about freshman, sophomore, junior, senior, that's about what the ratio probably should be. But still, beyond just that statistic, it is a first-year starting quarterback for the full season. 2 new transfer wide receivers, transfer running back, a freshman running back in Bo Walker we expect could play a pretty big role here. Freshman receivers could play. That when you actually start kind of rattling through some of the positions and some of the names, yeah, there are a lot of guys that are going to be called on for Georgia that don't have much in the way of experience, right?
I think the biggest takeaway is, and Connor and I have touched on this before in our show DawgNation at Large, is remember last year when Georgia beat the brakes off of Clemson and they put out that really pretty graphic of the 30 freshmen or guys that hadn't played before that got to be a part of the game? Well, then after that, all of the games were so close that a lot of those guys that were in their first year got very little time, and a lot of those guys are going to be the ones that are going to have to step into starting roles this year or play a lot of snaps. And so even though that number doesn't really jump off the page when Kirby Smart says it, when you start looking into specifically the second-year guys, that's when I think some of the concern comes up, because we only know so much from what we've seen, but a lot of the players, our breakout stars and everything in between, is a lot of what we speculate based on their high school rankings and the chatter that we've heard, but we're not really going to know about what a lot of these players are going to be able to do until that first game at Marshall, and maybe even so that first road game at Tennessee, when they really have to showcase what they have.
Connor, I guess if I'm being honest, the one thing that I probably would have liked to have heard more today, and I don't mean it's bad that it didn't happen, I mean I just would have been more entertained if it had, and we talked about this on one of the shows in recent days, the chance to come here and coming off a national championship in 2021, Kirby's, hey, we're not going to be complacent, we're going to be the hunter, we're not going to be hunted. I would have loved to have heard a little bit more in the way of people doubt us because we lost a couple games last year. People say our offense isn't good. I was sort of expecting Georgia to come here and kind of take on head first a little bit more some of the prevailing criticism that's existed during this offseason from January till now. And boy, it just seems like a lot of that was absent today. Georgia didn't say much about it. To the best that I can tell, there weren't tons of questions about that. I was sort of anticipating and maybe even hoping for, just because it would have been fun to watch the back and forth on it, that to be more of a talking point, and boy, it just didn't happen.
And to your point, and this may be perhaps too inside baseball, but when we sat down with Kirby Smart in the local session, he noted that there were less people here. That there was just there was a lack of national media people here, and those are the types of people I think that would have asked the questions about Mike Bobo, about Gunner Stockton and what he brings to the table, and all the questions that come with that. And just in general, and being around here the last 2 days, and I think Kirby Smart picked up on this, is this perhaps why they were not as willing to go out there and say things with their chest, because the last time they came here in 2022, I thought Kirby gave perhaps his most effective and forceful preseason sort of State of the Union when he talked about how Georgia wasn't going to be the hunted, they were still going to be the hunters, and that team goes on to win a national championship that year. I think it speaks to how different this sport is, both from the people who cover it, but also just how the coaches interact with it. We heard Kirby Smart mention multiple times 54% of this roster is in their first or second year with the program. Now, I'm not a huge math guy, but when we start getting back and away from the extra guys that had the COVID year, that's how math is supposed to work out, where 25% of your class is freshmen, 25% is sophomores, 25% is juniors, 25% is seniors. But it just sort of speaks to, I think, tonally just how much this sport has changed. And I think SEC Media Days further reflects that.
Okay, before we get into the Tyler Atkinson stuff, and I do feel like we need to talk about that, let me mention one more thing that Kirby Smart had to say. And I think this probably requires a little bit of a sell job for me, because I think the one thing that's pretty apparent, hanging around other media people, kind of watching the reaction to some of the media day stuff, people are sort of over the procedural topics. Mm-hmm. The topics of, hey, what's next, the college football playoff, and a lot of the stuff that dominated SEC spring meetings. I think people are sort of done with that now. And yet, even with my acknowledgement of that, I think what Kirby Smart said today about his belief on a 9-game conference schedule, which the SEC may eventually move to, I think it's pretty interesting. I want to explain why I feel that way. I thought, Smart gave a very fan-friendly explanation for why he likes the 9-game schedule of, hey, it's more good games for fans, basically alluding to the fact this is supposed to be an entertainment product, and obviously fans are entertained by more games in the SEC. But then he gave voice to something that just seems self-evidently true, that somewhere over the course of the last few months, we found out about it at SEC spring meetings, but pretty clearly it may have happened prior to that. We just became aware of it at that time. This league, the key decision makers in this league, and I think that Smart is influential as anybody on this, they just changed their mind about a couple things. That they were, I think, moving towards the 9-game schedule for the future of the conference because ESPN was willing to pay for it. It's weird saying this because Greg Sankey's standing right there. But they were moving towards the 9-game schedule because ESPN was willing to pay for it. But when they saw the behavior of the College Football Playoff Selection Committee, they said, and Kirby basically said this out loud. We played the clip on DawgNation Daily this morning. They said, I'm not sure this is a good idea. And when they were going to maybe think about supporting the automatic qualifiers for the 16-team playoff, they said, I'm not sure this is a good idea either. Kaylee, it is interesting to me that the key decision makers in this league just change their mind. They have a right to, and they change their mind. And I do think that's interesting.
Well, one thing I think it's important to note, too, is every single coach that goes up here this week is going to tell you that they're not going to shy away from an extra game. But I think at the end of the day, if they keep it at the 8-game, nobody's going to be all that disappointed, and not even just because of the college football playoff stuff and how that worked out. But think about all the injuries, especially if you're a team that can actually compete in the playoffs. One less SEC game is good for you because we saw how much injuries impacted the outcome of what happened for all the SEC teams later down the road, having to have that extra game of being really, really physical and knowing what you're getting on the other side of the line of scrimmage. Like, nobody's going to come out and say, well, yeah, we just want to play 8 games, but they're not going to also go against that either because in the long run it's better for everyone, and we saw that with the college football playoff last year.
But I think you're right. But do you also get what I'm saying here in the fact that there's so much like gobbledygook around all this, or mumbo jumbo, where it's just like it all sounds like just circular, talking. But in the case of the SEC, the prominent voice in this league, they have been very clear about one thing. They do not like the behavior of the selection committee, and so therefore the future of their scheduling model, the future of their preference for an expansion of the playoff, if that were to happen, it is greatly impacted right now by their seemingly unified dissatisfaction in the College Football Playoff Selection Committee, and I do think that's interesting.
And I think last year, and Georgia played a role in this in particular, when they lost a game and they got dropped behind Miami and Indiana teams. They were frankly better than anybody that would watch those teams. I think would say that Georgia was the better football team. But when the College Football Playoff Committee no longer takes in strength of opponent or strength of schedule into consideration in the manner in which they did a season ago, and instead just look at wins and losses, I think you see why there was the sea change, where in the past, I think Kirby Smart has been a very pro person in terms of going to a 9-game conference schedule. I no longer believe that is the case because I believe Kirby Smart would prefer to play the 8 SEC games and go play a marquee non-conference game because odds are, like we saw with Clemson last year, you can play a big non-conference team and that can do a lot of good for your league and a lot of good for your resume if you win that league. And the reality is that team's probably not going to be able to match up and withstand the blow-by-blow that a lot of these SEC teams are on a week-by-week basis. So I think that proved to be an illuminating experience for Georgia. And with Kirby Smart being one of the more, I think, vocal pro-9-game schedules, the fact that he softened that stance, I think, to your point, BA, speaks to a sea change that we have seen with regard to this.
I think that's right. All right, so in addition to SEC Media Days, earlier today, 5-star linebacker Tyler Atkinson, which Georgia had been a major presence in his recruitment, really going back to the time when he was the 8th grade, made the decision to commit to Texas. This had been tipped off basically within the last 24 hours. He did so today on the Pat McAfee Show. What's your reaction to the Atkinson news and the entire, I guess, the universe of discussion that happens around it?
Yeah, this is a guy who's the best high school football player in the state of Georgia this year. He is a Caleb Downs level of player. And I understand if you're a Georgia fan out there that is upset that the way that this is played out. However, and in seeing some of the comments and everything that has gone from that, I think they're important. And if you want to call this copium or whatever slang term you want to use, that's fine. In an age where money is, I think, going to be more important than ever, how you spend it is key. As great of a player as Tyler Atkinson is, he does not play a premium position like I think a quarterback, a wide receiver, a defensive end, defensive lineman, or an offensive tackle. And so because of that, I think you can be a little bit more weary about how you spend your money there. 2, when you recruit a guy for as long as Georgia has recruited him, since he was an 8th grader, and you have, specifically at the linebacker position, developed 3 Butkus Award winners and 3 first-round draft picks, At a certain point, if he's still wishy-washy and going, sort of, let me hear what Clemson has to say. Oh, let me hear what Oregon has to say. Oh, let me hear what Ohio State, who we thought for a long time was a major player in this recruitment. And then at the 10th hour, Texas enters the chat, and they become a major player. At a certain point, I think if you really wanted to go to Georgia, you would have elected to go ahead and do so. And so losing Tyler Atkinson to Texas, it's a blow. He's a guy you're going to see in this league. It's a guy who's going to make a lot of plays for Texas. But there is a way that I think Georgia can make up for not landing him by adding pieces in the aggregate. That's landing a Nick Abrams, who's set to announce his commitment tomorrow. That's maybe making sure you're able to keep 5-star defensive lineman James Johnson, and potentially land 4-star defensive lineman Valdon Sun, who's set to announce later this week. And if you're able to spread the money that you were willing to pay for Atkinson around, I think that's how in the long run you make up for it, especially when Georgia won in part because of depth. And while depth, yes, is a more rarefied commodity in this day and age, and not landing a player like Tyler Atkinson absolutely hurts, if you're able to try and use the money you would spend to land a player of Atkinson's caliber around the roster, I think that's how you make up for this.
What do you think, Kaylee?
It's one of those things where we always knew how close it was, and I think if he really wanted to go to Georgia, that decision would have been made a lot sooner. So the fact that he did wait this long, from the second they announced yesterday that he would do it on the Pat McAfee show this morning, I didn't feel really good about what Georgia was going to do, because at this point in the cycle, these teams that don't have as many commits as Georgia are willing to put a lot of financial backing into getting a player like Tyler Atkinson. And now it's one of those things where, you have to move past it, because in the NIL era, you were going to pay a lot for Tyler Atkinson to begin with. So I'm with Connor. There's different ways to, spread around this money, especially knowing the depth that you have at the linebacker room, because they already have Shadarius Tootle. There's a really good chance they're going to get Nick Abrams. Then you've got 5-star linebacker Zayden Walker, who's going to sit on the bench all year. So it's even though you don't have him their share, that's okay. You've got guys behind you, but like Connor mentioned, you could put this money towards keeping somebody else at Georgia, or at least for me personally, I think this would be good money to use on a running back, a premium position like that, because
Maybe
they
Sunday.
only signed. Listen, hear me out. They only signed Bo Walker in last year's class. They currently only have Jay Lamar. They need at least 2 running backs in this cycle, and running backs are already off the board. You've got a chance with Jarrett Cooper and still Savion Hyder. So I would rather take the money that they were potentially going to give Atkinson and put it into a position that actually scores touchdowns.
I think it's interesting. So here is, I guess, my only thought on this, and we talked about this obviously earlier today a little bit too, in that I can't get stressed out too much about Atkinson, because overall I feel like Georgia's actually doing really well. I mean,
they're gonna if they land Abrams tomorrow, they'll have the number 1 class in both recruiting sites.
Yeah, I feel like you don't have a whole lot of room to complain if that's the case, and yet I also understand how long Atkinson has been in our life and been someone we talk about. I think the sense that I get from a lot of Georgia fans is this isn't so much frustration with Georgia or even anger at Atkinson. I do think people are a little burned out's the wrong word. I think people are a little – I don't think they understand the recruiting process the way they once did, because we had Jeff Sentell on DawgNation Daily. Hey, Georgia knocked the ball out of the park for the Tyler Atkinson official visit. That used to mean something. The sheer number of visits that Atkinson has taken over the course of years, that used to mean something. And to a degree, it still does. Kirby said today they leverage relationships in recruiting, and a lot of times that works. But boy, when it doesn't work, I think that people are just getting really irritated that the recruiting process and the way they used to follow it just doesn't quite feel the same way that it used to.
And to your point, yesterday afternoon, Steve Wilfong and Chad Simmons of Rivals both reported, this was around 6 o'clock, that Georgia, it looked like Atkinson was going to end up at Georgia, that they believed Atkinson would ultimately end up at Georgia. Gets announced that Atkinson is announcing on the Pat McAfee show. Within that hour, it now flips to Texas. And I think that, recruiting, so much of it is a long-haul type of thing. And the way that we have been conditioned to understand it is, that February, even December signing date was going to be the payoff. And now, if you're a fan of this, I understand you not wanting to get super invested in these recruitments, not so much because you worry about whether they're going to end up at UGA or how long they're going to stay there, but because you can put in so much effort and so much care into following this recruitment. And then at the 11th hour, it just sort of changes. I think the Justice Terry loss last season was a lot bigger than the Atkinson was. I think the Cantwell one was as well. And so maybe that makes this one sting a little bit. But it nonetheless is a pattern that we have continued to see in recruiting, especially at a place like Georgia where, you can do, I think, everything right, which I believe Georgia did with the Justice Terry recruitment, with the Jackson Cantwell recruitment, and the Tyler Atkinson recruitment, and still have things come undone at the last hour. I think that makes things really hard for an average fan to follow, and much more frustrating, I think, from a coaching standpoint.
Final word, Kaylee.
I think it comes down to something called the rule and the exception. And pre-NIL, the rule essentially was that you devoted so much time to a person, especially in the state of Georgia. Typically, things would go your way, and there was usually maybe one exception where it didn't go their way. And now we look at what happened with Justice Terry and Tyler Atkinson and Jackson Cantwell, where you do everything right, and now that's the rule. And then you have somebody like Elijah Griffin, who they put the same amount of time and effort into him, and he committed to Georgia. And fans were happy about that because they knew the relationships that had been built since he had been in 8th grade. And suddenly now he becomes the exception to what once was the rule.
And we're going to wrap up here. I guess the other thing I have to make mention of is that there are those who've tried to turn this into some sort of, Texas is getting over on Georgia because of Terry at the end of last cycle, because of Atkinson here today. And listen, no doubt Georgia wanted both those recruits and had spent a long time recruiting them. There's no doubt. But this is not Texas getting over on Georgia, given the fact that Georgia beat them twice on the field last year, and will have a chance to beat them a third time here this November. The idea that somehow, Texas is up over Georgia because of a couple of recruiting wins in what has otherwise been a stellar recruiting cycle for Georgia, beating out Texas for players where Texas, we're led to believe, was the biggest NIL offer on the table. Georgia's still winning those recruiting battles. I'm sorry, the attempt to turn this into a narrative of Texas is taking what it wants from Georgia, probably no surprise. I don't buy that at all.
Yeah, I think Texas has an obsession with Georgia, and hearing players, Georgia players today, CJ Allen, Daylen Everrette, Gunner Stockton as well, those guys got a lot of questions from Texas media about Texas, about those Texas games a year ago. Daylen Everrette in particular got a very strange question. Do you have a vendetta against Texas? And I do think that as Georgia started things today here and Texas is wrapping things up behind us, as you can kind of see the media, I think, gathering for where Arch Manning might be, it's only, I think, a further step of, okay, Georgia and Texas, they were the top 2 teams in the SEC last year. They're probably going to be the top 2 teams in the SEC preseason poll. And ultimately, these are 2 teams that are going to continue to battle. And I think losing Atkinson to Texas, like they lost in Terry, makes these recruitments all the more frustrating, because right now Georgia is still clearly a better team on the football field than Texas is.
So is this Arch's podium right
That's
here?
what we're thinking.
That's what I think.
Okay, well, there you go. I know Kaylee.
It is.
You can't
Yes,
tell
it
by
is.
the 8 million people that are standing there.
I know, Kaylee, you got to get down there and see all that, and I'm looking forward to seeing some of that myself. Wrapping up here for day 2, SEC Media Days. I think you both have done outstanding jobs with your coverage here. In fact, we'll get a chance to hear from both of you on video throughout the rest of the week. Really looking forward to all of that. Big thanks to our friends at Merriweather and Tharp, your source for Georgia divorce, helping provide this Media Days coverage. I'll see you tomorrow morning for DawgNation Daily. Kaylee and Connor throughout the day at both DawgNation.com and on the DawgNation video channels. Thanks for being a part of a really fun week for us here live at SEC Media Days, courtesy of our friends at Merriweather and Tharp.